again, we're looking at Psalm 23. He restoreth my soul. Again, present tense, ongoing. He continually restores my soul. Which means He makes it anew. He draws it back to God. He revives it, grants repentance, spiritual refreshment, imparts strength. All of that is part of Him reviving or refreshing our soul. We're looking at what God uses to do this. He, of course, uses His Word, which we looked at last week. It's important that we stay in His Word, because that's what God uses. He also can reveal Himself. He reveals Himself in His Word first, but He can reveal Himself in many ways, and that also can be a way of bringing restoration of soul. He reveals Himself in creation, of course, reveals Himself in providence and His direction of things. So it's simply the manifestation and the display of Himself. He can also use circumstances to bring restoration of soul. They can be favorable circumstances. They can be what we call adverse circumstances. God is able to use whatever the circumstance to bring restoration of soul to His people. God, of course, brings about circumstances for His own purpose. He can use these circumstances to speak to us. He can use them to prepare us. He can use them to reveal Himself or reveal ourselves and our need. And God can use circumstances, of course, to strengthen faith, which is part of restoration of soul. God uses affliction for our good, which can again be restoration of soul. That's what we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. Paul's thorn in the flesh, he used affliction to keep Paul where he needed to be. So the restoration power of God is seen in circumstances. One of the best examples, we're not going to take the time, would be in the life of Joseph, how God directed circumstances in Joseph's life. Another good example would be Paul and Silas, how God directed circumstances to get His people where He wanted His people to be. And Paul recognized God's use of circumstances. Notice in Philippians chapter 1, Philippians chapter 1 and verse 12 through verse 14. Paul says, "But I would ye should understand, brethren, that the things which happened unto me," that's circumstances, "have fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel." That is, God used these circumstances to further or to give more opportunities to proclaim the gospel. "So that my bonds," his imprisonment, "in Christ are manifest in all the palace and in all the other places." That's how God got the word to the palace. "And many of the brethren in the Lord waxing confident by my bonds. So God restored many of the brethren by putting Paul in what you and I would consider adverse circumstances, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. So God sovereignly decrees and designs circumstances so that we end up where He wants us to be, even when we're not aware, even when we do not have a conscious part in getting to that place. God uses circumstance, and He does that in the restoration of the soul as well. God in His power and wisdom uses circumstances in our lives to bring about restoration. But God in His power and wisdom also can use the circumstances in someone else's life to bring us restoration of soul. That's why we read in Romans 8:28 that all things work together for the good, for them that are called according to His purpose. And then what we want to concentrate on tonight is the Lord uses corrective discipline to bring about restoration of soul. I believe that most of God's people have a wrong perception of the discipline of the Lord, or the corrective discipline of the Lord. First of all, we need to realize what discipline is. It's not just punishment. It's to disciple. To discipline is to train. It's to train. And God does that with us. That's the purpose of corrective discipline. It's to train. That is, it's to draw us. It's to educate us. It's to instruct us. It's to drill us. Discipline is drilling us. Sometimes it needs to break us. Our will needs to be broken, brought into conformity with His. Means to tame us. It's all for the purpose of forming us, to make us prepared for whatever it is that God has for us. So this training, it also involves correction, corrective discipline. And the purpose, well, one of the reasons for corrective discipline is authority is established. We'll never be what we ought to be if God's authority is not established in our life. Authority must be established. Now, that's true, of course, in our discipline of children, or authority is being established. There has to be a recognition of authority. And it has to be received in a proper spirit. If the Lord corrects us, uses corrective discipline, and we raise up our fist or we stiffen our neck or back, guess what? Your life's going to be miserable. We have to have a proper spirit. God, in correcting us, is getting our heart. He's getting our heart. So we want to look at this. If we go to Hebrews chapter 12, Hebrews chapter 12, we'll read verses 5 through 11, and then we'll go back and look at some things. And ye have forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as unto children. My son, despise not thou the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. If ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? But if ye be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then are ye bastards and not sons. Furthermore, we have had fathers of our flesh which corrected us, and we gave them reverence. Shall we not much rather be in subjection unto the Father of spirits and live? For they, that is, our earthly fathers, verily for a few days chastened us after their own pleasure, or as they saw fit. But he, for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of the righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. So the first thing we want to consider is what is meant by corrective discipline. Well, it's seen in the passage that we just read by several words, several verbs that are used. In verse 5, you have the word chastening. You see the same thing in verse 7 and again in verse 11. In verse 6 and verse 7, you see the word chasteneth. In verse 10, there is the word chastened. Those are all verbs. And then there is the noun in verse 8, chastisement. So the question is, what does it mean? What does it mean? Well, the meaning of the words are seen in other words that are used throughout the New Testament. For example, in 2 Timothy, if we keep a mark there in Hebrews, and 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 25, in meekness instructing. That's what chastisement is. That's what corrective discipline is. It is for the purpose of instruction. So when God chastens us, He's instructing us. And life will be much easier if you hear the instruction that is being issued. So God is not chasing us out of frustration. God doesn't get frustrated. He's not just chasing us out of anger. He's doing so for instructional purposes. It's for instruction. So that's a good thing. It's a wonderful thing. Also in Titus chapter 2, in verse 12, teaching us, which is the same, just another way of saying instructing. That's what chastisement is. That it's instruction. It's a certain type of instruction. It is teaching. So there's a purpose behind the chastening. Instruction. Teaching. You have the words instruction, 2 Timothy 3:16. The Word of God is one of the functions it serves is for instruction. In Ephesians chapter 6, Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4, and fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. The nurture, that's one of the purposes. So chastening involves instruction. It involves teaching. It involves nurture. You take all of those things, and the idea is discipline, discipleship, training, teaching that God uses toward His children. And if it's what God uses toward His children, then it is an act of love and relationship. It's an act of love and relationship. And it's presented that way here in Hebrews chapter 12. So let's again go back to Hebrews 12. Verse 5. The exhortation which speaketh unto you has unto children. My son. There's a relationship. There's a relationship. It's in the context of chastisement or corrective discipline. So this is an act of love. It's a relationship issue. In verse 6, for whom the Lord loveth, He chasteneth. So again, it's an act of love. He chasteneth and scourgeth, there it is again, every son whom He receiveth. Verse 7, if ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as with sons. So this corrective discipline, God is dealing with us, not as His enemy, but as His children, as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father, there it is again, it's a father-son relationship. Verse 8, we see it again. And in verse 9, furthermore, we have had fathers. There's that relationship again. So, this corrective discipline is an expression of His love. It's an expression of a relationship between us and God. It is an expression of His care. Deuteronomy chapter 8, again, keep a mark there in Hebrews, but Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 5. Thou shalt also consider in thine heart that as a man chasteneth his son, so the Lord thy God chasteneth thee. As a man chasteneth his son, so the Lord thy God chasteneth thee. That is, as a father and son, as a father does toward his son. So again, it is an act of His love. It is an act of His care. Someone says, I've heard it many times, well, I'm not going to discipline my children. I love them too much. No, that's not the issue. That really isn't the issue. Because if you love them, you will train them. In Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 12, Proverbs 3 and verse 12. For whom the Lord loveth, He correcteth. There's that discipline. It's correction. It's corrective discipline. Even as a father, the son in whom He delighteth. So we see it's an act of love, it's an act of from a relationship, it's an act of care. But it also shows that He delights in us, that He has an affection toward us. And God uses this corrective discipline to restore souls. He does it all the time. He can use His Word to do it. He can use circumstances to do it. But He corrects. And He does so to train us, to restore us. Now, here in Hebrews 12, there are different aspects in varying degrees of the chastening of the Lord. And that also is seen by several words. So all corrective discipline is not the same. It's not the same. The Lord may use corrective discipline on me in one way, and you might do the same thing, and He might use His corrective discipline upon you in an entirely different way. That's His business. That's His business. He knows best. So there are different aspects in varying degrees. In verse 5, we see, when thou art rebuked of Him. That's a form of corrective discipline. To rebuke is a form of discipline. It's a form of training. The purpose of the rebuke is to train, to correct. It's an expression of disapproval. It's an expression of disapproval. God expresses His disapproval. He does so in His Word. He does so by the Holy Spirit. But God expresses His disapproval. That is a form of discipline. And it's always wise to listen to the rebuke. It may save you a more severe degree of chastening. So to be rebuked is a reprimand. It's a reproving. Again, but the purpose is to correct us, to bring restoration of soul. In verse 6, for whom the Lord loveth, He chasteneth and scourgeth. And scourgeth. Now that's another degree of corrective discipline. It speaks of a whip. Again, they scourged Christ before they crucified Him. It speaks of a whip. It speaks of an instrument of punishment. So we have two forms, two degrees so far. You have rebuke and you have scourgeth. I believe probably every time, if we were to examine the Lord's correction of us, He rebukes first before He scourges. I believe we'll find that to be true. The problem is we don't listen to the rebuke many times. So the next step is a more severe form of the correction. But again, it's all for the same purpose. To train us, to teach us, to restore our soul. So the scourging, of course, is a more severe form of discipline. But notice verse 6. For whom the Lord loveth, He chasteneth and scourgeth every son. Again, it's a more severe form, but again, it's still an act of love. A son, notice, whom he receiveth. So the scourging is not a rejection of the person. He scourges every son whom he receiveth. Aren't you glad that when God corrects us in His discipline, when God scourges us, He doesn't reject us, but He receives us? Because again, the purpose is to restore. The purpose is to teach. The purpose is to draw us closer to Him. And another word in verse 9, furthermore, we have had fathers of our flesh which corrected us. Now that conveys the idea of setting aright. It means to rectify a behavior. You can rectify the behavior by rebuke. You can rectify the behavior by scourging. But it's to rectify, it's to amend. And again, it can be done in the form of rebuke or scourging. That's God's business. But what we need to remember is it's for our benefit. It's for the purpose of bringing about restoration. So the point is, the chastening of the Lord has a God purpose. God does not just punish us for the sake of punishing us. There's always purpose. And we would be wise to see that purpose. The entire subject matter here in Hebrews 12, 5 through 11 is a continuation of verses 1 through 4, where we find the subject of perseverance in the service of the Lord. And one of the purposes of God's discipline is to enable us, to prepare us. That's part of the training. Again, discipline is training. Training is preparation. It's preparing us. It's preparing us to persevere in the Lord's service. So the Lord will exercise discipline many times in bringing about the restoration of soul. He'll exercise corrective discipline. And restoration of soul is necessary to perseverance. Other purposes, again, it must have a purpose. Has to have a purpose. I can look back on childhood, and I don't think I could always say that Dad's corrective discipline served a purpose. It might have for him sometimes, just to let out steam and frustration. But God always has purpose when He corrects us. Always. And it's always a purpose for our benefit. Always. So notice verse 9. Furthermore, we have had fathers of our flesh which corrected us. However, whatever form that correction took, it could have been rebuke, it could have been scourging. Whatever form it took, that's really not the issue here. And we gave them reverence. That is, it put us in our place. We gave them reverence. Shall we not much rather be in subjection unto the Father of spirits and live? So one of the purposes of God's corrective discipline is to bring us into subjection. Again, God can use His Word to do that. Many times God rebukes us in His Word. And we save ourselves a lot of problems if we just submit. If we just submit, we'll save ourselves the next degree. So there's subjection. Notice, again, keep a mark there, but in Psalm 39 and verse 9, I was dumb, I opened not my mouth, because thou didst it. This is in the context of the Lord rebuking him. In verse 10 he says, remove thy stroke away from me. He said, I was dumb and opened not my mouth. They didn't complain. They didn't argue. Because I knew the Lord did it. In other words, I knew I'm supposed to be in subjection to Him. Another purpose is for our spiritual profit. Again, verse 10 of Hebrews 12. For they, our earthly fathers, verily for a few days chastened us after their own pleasure. That is, as they saw fit. Was their correction always right? No, it wasn't. But they did so as they saw fit, and they did so more from a temporal interest. But God is different. But He for our profit. God always administers corrective discipline for our profit, for our spiritual profit, for the development of our character, for the enrichment of our spiritual life, to bring us into conformity. Again, there in verse 10, that we might be partakers of His holiness. Another purpose of God's, that's conformity, but that would include to wean us from self, to wean us from the world. God corrects us. Another reason is that we be spiritually productive. That we would be spiritually productive. Verse 11, now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but it's grievous. That's how it's supposed to be. You spank a child and that child laughs at you, you didn't spank them hard enough. That's plain and simple. It's not supposed to be joyous. Nevertheless, afterward, there should always be an afterward. That's the purpose. Afterward, it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness. So, once again, God corrects us, whatever the degree is, whether it be rebuke or scourging, doesn't matter. Whatever the degree, whatever the aspect, it's that we be spiritually productive. Again, it's an act of love. It's an act of a father-son relationship. So God does this to bring restoration of soul. There must be a right attitude toward the Lord's corrective discipline. If there isn't, then our soul hasn't been restored. If the Lord administers corrective discipline, whether it be rebuke or scourging, and we don't have a right attitude toward it, then kind of defeats the purpose. We're to have a right attitude. And this is seen in Hebrews 12, verse 5. My son, despise not thou the chastening of the Lord. Despise not. That is, don't treat it in a lighthearted manner. If the Lord rebukes you for something, reproves you for something, whether it be through the read word, the preached word, doesn't matter. Don't treat that lightly. Because if we do, there's going to be a more severe discipline. So that's to be our attitude. We don't treat that lightly. Our Father is displeased. And that ought to concern us. And that ought to restore our soul. Another thing he says here is that we're not to faint. We're not to faint, nor faint. Do not despise thou the chastening of the Lord, nor faint. Verse 5. Don't faint. Don't give up. Don't give way to despair or unbelief. Again, God uses this to bring restoration. And then we're to be exercised thereby in verse 11. It bringeth forth, it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. Make use of it. God our Father corrects us. Make use of the perfection of the correction. It's Micah 6 verse 9. Hear the rod and he who pointeth it. There's a voice in the rod. Hear it. Hear it. It brings about restoration of soul. So the implication is that there is a personal message in the corrective discipline of the Lord. It is a message from the Lord to us. Again, He can use His Word. He can use circumstances. Don't jump to conclusions concerning how the Lord deals with others. Something bad happens in their life. Well, that's the Lord punishing them. Not necessarily. That's Job's friends. Don't be like that. You really don't know. Even if a person is far from the Lord, they're backslidden, they have been for years, and the Lord brings adverse circumstances into their lives, you cannot correctly conclude they're being punished right there. Only the Lord knows that. So we have to be careful that we don't jump to conclusions. Someone's child dies. Well, that's the Lord correcting them. Come on. That is an act of cruelty. That you jump to a conclusion that you have no basis whatsoever. It may be true. It's possible. But you don't know that. So we have to be careful how we judge God dealing in the lives of others. But God's discipline is very much needed in the life of every child of God. And if it were not for such discipline, we would destroy ourselves. We would destroy ourselves, and we would destroy others. So we're thankful that God administers corrective discipline, or we would destroy ourselves. But God, in His love and care, does administer discipline in our lives. and will and does bring about restoration of soul. He restores us. And therefore, we are the blessed recipients of whatever form that the Lord administers His discipline. We're blessed because it's God the Father treating us as sons. In closing, if we turn over to Job chapter 5, Job chapter 5, verse 17, Behold, happy is the man whom God correcteth. Therefore despise not thou the chastening of the Almighty. Happy is the man whom the Lord correcteth. Why? Because it's the act of a father toward one of his sons. Psalm 94. Psalm 94, verse 12. Blessed is the man whom thou chastenest, O Lord, and here it is, and teachest him. That's the purpose. To teach. To teach a lesson. To train us. And then lastly, this is something we ought to desire. We ought to desire for the Lord to correct us. We ought to desire it because it's for our good. And because without it, we will destroy ourselves. Jeremiah 10, verse 24. O Lord, correct me. When's the last time you prayed that? O Lord, correct me. Correct what? Whatever needs correcting. And then notice what he says, but with judgment. That is, with your wisdom. God will do it right every single time. Correct me. And then notice, not in thine anger. Not in thine anger. Lest thou bring me to nothing. So we desired the corrective discipline of the Lord. So Psalm 23:3, He restoreth my soul. One of the ways that He does that is correction, corrective discipline. He can use His Word to rebuke us. He can use circumstances to give us warning and rebuke. And He can use the whip. But whatever God uses, it's for our spiritual profit. It's for our spiritual good. So this is a blessed statement. He restoreth my soul. What a blessing. That God, over and over and over and over and over again, brings restoration of soul. Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us in verse of song, and everyone stand, and Brother Dave will lead us in singing. We have a wonderful God that trains us every step of the way.